Welcome to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine, a show where we report, rebel, and tell it like it is. On this show, we center your concerns about rebuilding our nation and advancing the promise of equality. Join me as we tackle the most compelling issues of our times. Now, on today's inaugural show, we focus on police violence, a tale of race, sex, and gender. On this episode, we focus on women in policing, elevating the stories and experiences of women, which are often absent from the conversation. Even in recent weeks, as the nation has erupted in protests related to the tragic murder of George Floyd, some might argue that the killing of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, an emergency medical technician in Louisville, Kentucky, was an afterthought, even though her death was no less inhumane, violent, and preventable. Sadly, the history of violence against women is marked by state involvement, whether dating back to the antebellum South and legalized torture of Black women by slave patrols, to the horrific practices during Jim Crow, so vividly described by courageous and defiant women like Fannie Lou Hamer. The modern story of lethal policing has become far too pervasive, and even so, women are often shut out of the conversation about it as victims, officers, leaders, and researchers. Today's show offers a shift in that narrative. So I am very pleased and honored to be joined by special guests. They include Song Richardson. She is the Dean and Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California Irvine School of Law. Her scholarship has been published by law journals at Harvard, Yale, Cornell, Duke, and Northwestern, amongst others. Her article, Police Efficiency in the Fourth Amendment, was selected as a must-read by the National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys. She is an expert in implicit bias and has a groundbreaking article co-authored with Catherine Fisk on police unions. Anne-Lee Kringen also joins us. She is an assistant dean and associate professor of criminal justice at the University of New Haven. Her research focuses on organizational issues in policing, specifically addressing factors that affect diversification and organizational development. In addition to her research, she serves on the International Association of Chiefs of Police Research Advisory Committee. Now, I'm also joined by Laura Goodman today. She served in criminal justice for 35 years as a police officer, sergeant, and deputy chief of police in Minnesota. She was the Ombudsman for criminal victims for the state of Minnesota. Her work has focused on reducing violence against women, children, and increasing the representation of women in police leadership roles, and teaching officers how to effectively engage victims and hold offenders accountable for their behavior. And finally, Deirdre Fishel joins us. She is an independent filmmaker who has been writing and directing documentaries and dramas for 25 years now. She creates complex, realistic portraits that challenge mainstream stereotypes. Her most recent film, Women in Blue, addresses how women officers seek gender equity in Minneapolis, redefining what it means to protect and serve. Thank you all for being on this show. Now, Dean Richardson, let me begin with you. Your impressive body of work unpacks racism in policing. You've engaged in empirical studies to document implicit bias in policing, and you've worked with police departments across the country. So I want to ask you whether police violence can be explained by implicit bias.
Oh, thank you so much again, Professor Goodwin, for having me on this show and for that question. So the easy answer to that question is absolutely not. And I worry sometimes when we talk about implicit or unconscious racial bias that it becomes easy to blame everything on unconscious bias. But police violence of the type that we're seeing today has existed in our country for centuries. Right? The history of policing itself in the South was based on capturing and maintaining the very problematic practice of slavery. So we see both conscious, explicit racism that is run through policing from its very beginning, in addition to the fact that unconscious biases can also impact police racial violence. So even officers who view themselves as egalitarian, as feminist, as non-racist, could also engage in problematic racial violence. So I think it's both.
And it's interesting on that point because there's research, illuminating research that also suggests that uh, African American officers, for example, can in fact have biases against African Americans. What's your response to that? Does that hold out? Is that true?
Yes, that is absolutely true. And when we think about, I think one way to understand that is unconscious biases impact most people regardless of their race. And it's because our brains work like computer processors, right? And so our brains just learn from the environment, from the society in which we live. So whether we are African American, whether we are Asian, whether we are white, many of us can have these unconscious biases. And then the structure of policing itself, the structure of policing becomes its own thing, right? Its own identity. So no matter what your racial background is as an officer, you learn what it means to be a police officer. And for Black officers, I often think we could refer to it as a type of double consciousness, right? I wrote a recent piece about this with Devin Carbato at UCLA, about the role that Black police officers have in police departments where they want to both be blue and Black. And navigating that tension can be very difficult, which can explain some of the problematic practices that Black officers engage in themselves.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pivot back to you, but I'd like to expand this and include Laura Goodman. So, Laura, you have been at the center of policing for your career. You've spent more than 35 years on the ground and dealing with these issues, picking up many of the same kinds of research that Dean Richardson has. What is the story behind women and policing? For so many departments, there is no equity or equitable representation, one might say, of women on police forces. Women who come in often don't stay. What's the story behind that?
Well, I think that first of all, women are actually in police departments today. They're actually going down in numbers. Like in 2000, when the National Center for Women in Policing was first studying this, women were at about 14.5%. Now we're about 12% nationally. So first of all, the problem is that women aren't getting the jobs to begin with. We know even in Minnesota here that about 50% of our schools are women. Our schools of law enforcement are women, and yet only 12% making it onto our departments. That screams of discrimination. The discrimination is in the hiring process, in what they're looking for, and how women are screened out. So many of the departments have pre-hire physical fitness agendas that most women can't afford, that are highly related to brawn and upper body strength, which many women don't have. So they either don't apply or they don't get in to begin with.
And Laura, just one moment on that. So this question about brawn and upper body strength, how necessary is that actually? I mean, there are studies that show that the majority of the work that officers do is actually a lot of desk work and things that don't actually require brawn. I mean, is that right? I mean, the research that's coming out now that shows that it's really not a lot of shoot 'em up and speed chases, but it's the sort of milder version of serving and protecting.
That's true. So I think there's less than 4% of the whole police day that, or the whole police life, that is violent crimes at all.
So wait,
So
let's
what?
pause on that. You say less than 4%?
Yes.
Okay.
Less
Well,
than
that puts a lot in
4%.
context, doesn't it?
And yeah, and then here's the biggest test though. When you if you have a department that doesn't require officers every single year to meet that fitness standard, then you've basically said it's not a necessary standard. I mean, how many overweight officers do we see out there on the streets? If it's not a standard for them, it shouldn't be a standard for anybody. The standard should be a medical effectiveness. So you don't have a heart condition or some medical condition that would be a problem on the job. You should have you should be fit, but it shouldn't. There's lots of ways to be fit without having to do 25 push-ups in 30 minutes or jump over a 6-foot wall, which even though women have sued about that 6-foot wall, there are still departments and schools that use that 6-foot wall for testing. So it's not something that actually happens on the job. This isn't TV. That's not how policing really is.
Hmm. Well, it builds forward from the conversation that we're having with Dean Richardson, which is, one about implicit biases. It strikes me that this is another level or layer of implicit bias, this notion that it's all brawn, that it's run and shoot, and that there's not a need for the intelligent part behind policing.
Well, I think it's really about the fact that men have created these systems. They have created it. They've decided what's important and what's not important. And some of these requirements are frankly made to keep small framed men and women out. So I mean, if you really rethink what police do every day on an average, it's mostly helping people and social justice work and things like that require more ability to problem solve and think critically and be creative and know the resources in their neighborhood so they can provide that to people, that they can help people help themselves.
Right, right. So here, Anne, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. Your research focuses on diversification and organizational development in policing, and specifically looking at issues related to women and policing. What does your research help us to understand about the sort of current status of policing in the United States, building on what Laura has just shared with us, which is that, women, there are barriers to women coming onto police forces, and clearly there are some significant issues with regard to retention.
Yeah, well, and Laura is right. There's, the hiring process and the physical fitness, and then there are a lot of other things that seem like seemingly small rules that really aren't that small when you actually think about that. And I think part of the problem is there are not enough women at sort of the leadership roles, the administrative roles in these police departments to kind of highlight these things. So, for example, I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with my co-author, Maddie Novick. And it was called, Is It Just Hair or Is It Everything? And it focused solely on a haircut policy that a major metropolitan police department had in place, where if you wanted to attend the academy as a woman, you could have hair no longer than an inch and a half. Right. And so when I came into this police department, and I'm very fortunate that I was in law enforcement. And so a lot of times I'm able to work with agencies because they know that I have sort of the background understanding of their job. But when I worked with this agency, I would interview, the recruiting officers, the background investigators, and the academy staff, and they would say, "Anne, it's the haircut policy." And I interviewed, some of the officers, right? The current officers, and you found this split, right? Some women said, "It's just hair. It's not a big deal." And while it's not very surprising for those of us who understand the literature and understand kind of cultural differences and significance with hair, this had a disproportionate effect on Black women, right?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, and so one of my favorite quotes, and I'm just going to read it because it's one that stays with me all of the time. Is she says, "Do I wish there were more Black women on the force?" And this is one of one of the few Black female officers in this major metro. She said, "Absolutely. Will there be more? Not if they keep making us cut our hair like that. It's an issue, and nobody understands it except the Black girls." That's the first thing you say, and they're like, "No, no, no. Hair is everything. It's a deal breaker." Right. And so we kept consistently getting this. And I remember finally bringing it up to administration, and they just looked at me. And granted, it was all white men. And they said, "We had no idea." Right. Like, we didn't even think about hair having that big of a role in a decision for a job. And I think that part of the problem is we don't have people in positions to make policies or to really critically evaluate these hiring practices, these rules, the issues related to attrition that say, no, these are, childcare is an issue, right? Shift work and how you navigate it, or how do you actually help people figure out the resources so that they can continue to do these types of jobs, shouldn't just be, hey, figure it out if you really want to do the job. And I think that has been a pervasive sort of attitude in policing, is if you really want to do it, you'll do anything.
So, it also sounds like without there being women on the inside, how do these messages then get communicated up to the top, right? So you have men who are serving in senior leadership in departments across the country. You see these kinds of impediments and gaps that relate, to issues such as hair. It is innocuous, things that don't relate to a person's ability to actually serve and protect one's hair. But how do you get those issues resolved if if women are not there, if women have been excluded?
Well, and it's not just that. I mean, like, even if there are women at the top, there's still women at the bottom who will be reluctant to support the woman at the top because they still have to fit in with the men that they're working with. So, I mean, I can think of issues over time. Like at one point, we were trying to make it okay for women to wear earrings, not dangly ones, but post earrings, because they wanted to be women. I mean, that goes to the hair issue too. We want to be women in this job. We're not trying to be mini men. We're trying to bring our own perspective. And if you reflect the community you serve, that includes women looking like women. So, it took a lot of struggle for us to get a policy for women to be able to wear earrings. And then, of course, right away, the men would be like, well, I want to wear earrings too. And and, and while today that wouldn't be a big deal, or it wouldn't even be different, back then it was different. So,
And the men
and
seriously did want to wear earrings. They weren't just trying to undermine women wanting to wear earrings. Is that right?
no, yeah, some of them really did want to wear earrings, but that was considered like really out there at the time. But now you look at it, when I go back to men make the rules. So now with tattoos and shaved heads and all those things are going on because men want them. Men want to be able to wear tattoos, and men want to be able to wear beards and mustaches and shave their head bald. So they get it.
Absolutely. And Michelle, you did raise the issue of an implicit bias too, and I think it plays a role for exactly these reasons with regard to hair and the physical requirements. Because when you think about what is our stereotypical view of a police officer, it is male, right? That's who we think about. And so that plays into what requirements we think police officers should have, what type of hair they should have, the type of ability to jump over a 6-foot fence. I mean, that doesn't happen that often, right? So we see the
Yeah, like,
interplay.
and in fact, when does that happen? I mean, really,
it,
is that like,
it,
when is that on the, day to day of a police officer? Oh, yeah, man, I just had to jump over a few 6-foot fences today.
It doesn't happen. And first of all, officer survival training would say, why would you jump over a 6-foot fence if you don't know what's on the other side? And my friend tells a great story about when a 6-foot fence did present, she just walked through the gate. So,
Exactly. Maybe because that's what women do, right? Like, sort of
yeah,
like, that thinking, like, why do I need to jump over this fence when I can just go through the door? I want to
exactly.
bring Deirdre Fishel into this conversation. This is a particularly poignant conversation for me because last year, my uncle, Charles Mays, who was a civil rights leader and who lived in Minneapolis, passed away. And the very street that I would drive on to go to his home was where George Floyd was tragically murdered. And so seeing that, not just the over 8 minutes, 8 minutes, 46 seconds video that was bravely videotaped by a young woman, a 17-year-old in Minneapolis, it resonated with me in particular ways, given that my uncle had, in fact, spent his entire career working towards social justice and elevating the concerns of all people, not just African Americans, but also of women. He was indefatigable in that. And so, what a tragedy. And I lived in Minneapolis prior to joining the faculty at the University of California at Irvine. I was a professor at the University of Minnesota in its law school, medical school, and school of public health. And so, the story behind George Floyd's murder really touched me in important ways. And Deidre, with your recent film, Women in Blue, addressing how women officers seek gender equity in Minneapolis, boy, is that ever timely. And I wanted you on this show because you've also been on the ground, then engaging in the stories of women officers in Minneapolis. Can you give us some insights about what brought you to that project? Why did you choose Minneapolis? What has it been like for you in the wake of these recent events?
So I got into making a film about women police officers. I don't come from a policing family at all, or had really not thought about women in policing. But Eric Garner was killed by an NYPD officer a couple of blocks away from where I was shooting my last film. And I do know one person in the NYPD, and she happened to be a woman. And I turned to her and I asked her point blank if it could have happened on her watch. It just seems so outrageous. And she said, absolutely not. That this young officer had quickly escalated the situation out of control, and that she would have started by simply saying, hi, my name is Sally Norris. What's yours? And I just kept thinking about those words. I know now that they're a de escalation technique, but to me, they just seemed human. And I started to think about this question of, do women police differently? And when I found statistics going back to the 1990s after the Rodney King beating, and when the Christopher Commission started investigating the LAPD, that showed that women communicate better, de-escalate better, and that they use excessive force in much lower rates than their male counterparts. And then I just felt like, wow, I was so upset about police violence, and I had never really thought about this angle of what could women bring to policing. And I knew there were very few, and I knew there had been calls even in the 90s for there to be many, many more. 43% is what they called for at that time to make a police department that was healthier and more humane. And I went to Minneapolis really for two reasons. I went because it had a woman chief, and Chief Harteau also really wanted to elevate this role of what women could bring, and she gave me tremendous access to the department. I mean, basically said, if a woman agrees to be in the film, you can follow her anywhere in any part of her job. But I also was interested in Minneapolis because it had both a history of police violence, and yet Chief Arto was really on a mission to transform and reform that police department. And I thought that tension of struggling to reform, and that women, I wouldn't be looking at women in a silo, but I would be looking at women in the context of the same struggles that police departments were having nationwide. And that's how I got, to Minneapolis. Um, the story that I thought I was going to tell, though, was not the story, because there were a series of police officer involved shootings in the 2 years that I was there.
Yes, yes. In fact, can you tell us a little bit about that? And, what's interesting as well is that, of course, Chief Artaud is no longer there. And it makes me wonder, and this will be a question that I'll open up to guests after you tell us a little bit more about your experience in filming, is about whether women pay a steeper cost when they are higher up in the ranks. Because after one of the shootings that took place during the time in which you were filming, she departed. And when you think about departments across the country where there have been police killings of unarmed people, of unarmed women, unarmed men, usually leadership stays. And very often the officers stay too, although she is gone. So, first, can you tell us a little bit about what happened during the time in which you were shooting?
Yeah. So we'd only been there about 3 months, and there was a an officer involved shooting. The racial dynamics of this were atypical. It was a white woman, who was an Australian woman, who was killed by a officer of color, and I think it became an international incident. I think the white community in Minneapolis really stood up with the Black community, and I think there was a lot of pressure at that point to have her resign. I also think, there are complicated political dynamics. She had a very difficult relationship with the mayor. And as well, there had been an earlier shooting of Jamar Clark, a young man of color, also by a white officer. And I think the Black community had really never forgiven her for that, although there were 3 investigations. So there were a lot of complex dynamics where she was asked to resign. And I think, in the end, she probably could have fought it, but I think she felt at that point that it would be better for the department if she stayed. I think what happened next was really totally shocking, because this was a police department that had almost like a single person consent decree to change the experience of women in the department, to try to recruit more women and to put women into every level of leadership. So it was a really unique police department with a woman chief. There was a woman assistant chief who was just retiring, as Chief Rondo, who's now the chief, was becoming assistant chief. There were commanders, there were heads of precincts. And I think that there was a feeling, because Chief Rondo had just been promoted assistant chief and had been promoted 4 or 5 times by Chief Artaud, that he would keep up with this idea that women could play a really important role, and to continue that commitment to elevating women in the department. He did not do that. No women were put into his executive team. And I think that really started a whole period of alienation of women in leadership, where they suddenly felt that their voices were not heard. There was not a lot of communication. They were moved around. And I think this is a really different thing that women want. It's not just communication when they're out on the street, it's also communication in an organization about why things are done and what's important, and working together and creating that kind of community. And I think what really hurt women was that there were no discussions anymore. It was like you were given a message. One of the women found out that she had not been promoted to the executive team when everyone in the department thought she would be, through
Hmm.
reading about it in the newspaper.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, to pivot and include now a broader conversation amongst us all, it also makes me think about the ways in which women are penalized and punished for doing their jobs or not elevated when they are doing their jobs exceptionally well. It reminds me of what's also been documented within the space of women as firefighters and these tragic, horrible stories of women waking in the middle of the night being peed upon by their male colleagues. And other kinds of horrors that happen, not just in terms of the administrative ladder and whether you hit a glass ceiling, but actually just the bullying and the ways in which the culture shuts women out in really horrific kinds of ways. Do any of you want to comment on that?
Well, it happens.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I mean, to really comment on that, because for so many in our audience, we have, there's a way in which women have made so many strides, and many of those strides have been without writing memoirs about what they encountered, such that now we're in a space where, it's possible that people might think, well, all things are equal. Women are not doing so badly. They actually do not know about what women have experienced over time and experience today in order to lift up these various spaces in which they work.
Absolutely. And some of this begins in the academy, right? There's some beautiful articles written about. There was a woman professor who embedded herself within a police academy, and she writes this beautiful piece about the way from the very beginning, right, with the way the instructors treated the female recruits who were in the academy, the way that the fellow recruits in the academy treated the female recruits without the instructors saying or doing anything about it, right? This socialization process of what it means to be an officer begins in the academy and continues throughout, right? As we've already heard from some of the other guests.
Mm-hmm. Laura, were you going to pick up on that?
Yeah, what she just said is true, and it even no matter what you learn in the academy, and even if there are women working in the academy, they're towing the line too, and so you get that, and then you get your first field training officers, which these are two places where I think are critical places to change. But you get your field training officers, which Chauvin was one of them, and the first thing they say is, I don't care what you learned in the academy, this is how we'd really do it. So a lot of times I hear people talk about policies of the police department. Many times the policies are just fine, but it's the standard of practice, what they actually do, that is what gets handed down from officer to officer, what has to be uh, part of how you do your work if you're going to belong in this club. And women are never going to belong in the club. They're just never going to. There are some that think they're going to, and everybody kind of tries to at first, but you're not in the club. You're not ever going to be in the club. And as soon as you get that over with, you can start behaving like you want to behave as a woman officer in this field.
So, what was that like for you, Laura? I mean, you spent decades on the ground and also in administration. How did you then carve a way for yourself and for those who came after you?
Well, it wasn't easy. I can tell you, like when I started in the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department, and I sued them for discrimination because
Well, there you go.
uh, they only hired enough women to work in the women's section. So they let all the women knew how to work master control, but they'd had all the women train the men, and then they just kept the women in the women's section, which meant that you didn't get to do the jobs that would help you in any promotion. And I had officers I was way senior to that got positions before I got positions. So that's why I sued them, and then I went to Minneapolis. And Tony Boza was the chief then, and he was very keen on hiring a lot of women. And he didn't care that I sued Ramsey County. All the power to me. Welcome aboard, Minneapolis. And at first, I loved it there. But my first FTO told me every single day
And
that
an FTO, Laura, what's an FTO?
It's a field training officer.
Okay.
So there was a short academy, and then you were in field training working with another officer. And every single day he told me, and more than once a day, that I had taken a job away from a white man. And so that's how it started,
And that was saying that to you as a white woman.
yes,
Right.
because I took a job away from a man, and he didn't care about anybody but white men. But it was like this is like every day, so you're fighting through this. I had colleagues who would pull up to a burglary, and they'd sit in the car, and the woman would say, well, shouldn't we go in and take a report? And throw it into park and say, go ahead, take a report. I mean, there were so many things that went on that were so bad, but you had to just get through it. You had to get through the probation and move on and try to do the job the best that you could. And after field training, again, I felt like I had a good career. I did a lot of important stuff when Tony Boza was there because he supported that. But when he left, it's like just like what you just said about Janae. When a good chief leaves, the department reverts back like pulling out a rubber band and having it snap loose. It just goes right back to the place that's comfortable for what men have decided it should be. So it's really hard to push forward and get ahead of this. Good chiefs are either not, they're either let go or they resign because of the pressure put on them to do so, or they're set up. So it's really there's a lack of political will by politicians to push through this and really make police reform work.
And it sounds like the experience that you had and also other officers really like a hazing that women go through rather than a training.
It is. It's not. It's. I mean, I. This was quite a while ago, so I don't know for sure what's going on today. But I do hear from women that they get this same sort of stuff. They're meant to just take it. Just take it. Just take all the sexist jokes and take whatever we call you and just put up with it. That's what you have to do. Whenever I hear that a woman is suing a police department, I just know how bad it was for her because there's so much that women actually tolerate before they get to that place that they just have to because they have to count on people for backup and they have to get along.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it also,
Oh,
oh,
sorry.
go right ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say, I mean, you know, it's so hard. You're so in the minority that it's sort of like the path of least resistance. So, in our film, you have a black woman sergeant with a, roll call of all white men. And, they kind of hassle her, they kind of tease her, they kind of do, lewd jokes. And I think what's incredible is that I don't think she even has the consciousness that that's something that you can fight against. It's just sort of the way it is. And I think that what's really scary to me is to watch, and I think I watched this with a young woman, is like this idea that every woman who's going to come in is going to be able to fight and do the right thing and not be influenced. And the young rookie that we followed, um, I watched as her behavior became more aggressive. And a really poignant moment for me was as a cop, you're not trained to question yourself. And at one point, she got into the patrol car. She had pushed somebody, and very small compared when you're thinking about excessive force. But she had lost control, and she had pushed someone. And she said, "I'm sorry that I pushed him, and I didn't think we were going to actually cite him, give him a citation." And her partner was like, "Well, no, he wasn't going to listen anyway." And if you've got male partners and you've got male sergeants, it's very hard to really stand up to that when the message that you're getting is don't think too much, just kind of enforce the law. And I really think it's, what we desperately need is not just women, but women who have a different view of policing, it isn't just about law enforcement. It's about what Laura said about caring for communities and protecting people and serving people. But I think that it's a very hard course for a woman like that to buck the system. And I really hope that the tragedy of George Floyd's death has led us to a level of understanding that police departments need some political will, some societal will to stand up for the officers in the department that are trying to change things. Because
Well, in
that
fact,
police culture is pervasive.
yeah, and with Breonna Taylor's death, I mean, across the country, right? To see this because George Floyd's death is horrific, and you were right there in Minneapolis, but across the country, we have seen this. I'm going to turn back to you, Song, in just a moment, but I wanted to think then about origins, right? So the very origins of policing in the United States were related to race, policing indigenous populations, and quite specifically the slave patrols. I mean, the very badges that are used today resemble almost identically. I mean, they're born from their predecessors, which were the slave patrol badges, which at the top said police and on the bottom said slave patrol, and instantiated into law were terms about how much one could actually brutalize, Black people. I mean, if you read the laws that established these forces in parts across the country, especially in the South, I mean, some of them explicitly listed, how much beatings you were entitled to, give, to a person who was enslaved. And so, part of the culture that we're talking about is not a culture that just begins out of nowhere, right? I mean, it's a part of a culture that over time brings us to today, except we tend to be rather ahistorical in the United States. So just as people are discovering Juneteenth, people are beginning to discover the origins of policing. And I'm going to pivot to you, Son, because I think you were just about to mention something.
Yes, and I want to pick up on that incredibly important point that you raised, right? Because we do need to take account of the history of policing because it's embedded in the very structures, right? The organizational structures and culture of policing. I mean, you mentioned the slave patrols and police enforcing Jim Crow laws, and you fast forward to some of what we heard the other guests talk about, which is if you challenge an officer, they will respond, right? Verbally challenge an officer. And you can tie that right back to if you're a Black individual that challenged an officer during Jim Crow, you are going to be put in your place violently. And that culture of not challenging officers, especially if you happen to be a person of color, remains in place today. But the thing I wanted to pick up on, and I don't remember who was saying this, it might have been Deirdre, about we need more women officers, we need a different type of policing, and if we had more women and people who are more community-oriented, things would change. I agree with that. I want to add one important piece to it. There is, and someone said this too, there is a lack of political will to really change police departments. Because if we really wanted to change police departments, we would change the structures of policing. And by that, I mean, what are the metrics management uses, brass uses, the chief uses to measure productivity of the rank and file? Is it how many stops and frisks you make, how many tickets you write, how many arrests you make? Because if that is the metric, then it doesn't matter how many people of color, how many women are in police departments, right? We have to change the way that we measure good policing. And that can come from the chief, but then you have to contend with the union. And then you have the union's power over the politicians. So we've been spending so much time in our country talking about police unions And I want people to remember that these contracts with the problematic provisions in them are approved by politicians, right? So let's not just look at the union, let's look at the politicians, let's look at the prosecutors, let's look at the laws that exist, because it's an entire system that creates the problems that we have today.
All right, so a hot button issue that I want us to pivot to then is, in fact, talking about police unions and the issue of abolition. So, in your work, you have, in fact, early on, right now, it's a bigger conversation about police unions, especially given that some of the heads of police unions have made it very clear their intentions regarding how policing should go in America. So, should there be a call for abolition? What do you all think about that? And then I'm going to pivot back to you, Song, about this question about police unions because you've written about this. So, Anne, Laura, Deirdre, abolition?
Are you talking abolition of police unions?
Well, what does it mean to you when people are articulating right now, that there should be an abolition of police forces, that there should be something different, that when someone calls 911, perhaps there are individuals other than police officers who should show up.
Well, I have grave concerns about that. I don't think that policing should be abolished. I think it should be changed. I think that maybe this event will give people the political will to do it. I hope so. Because there's ways I could sit down with 5 of my women colleagues and we could change this if anyone would let us. We think we know what needs to be done. But as far as unions are concerned, unions have always, police unions in particular, have always been so politicized, and that is what should stop. When you have in politics, the first thing they want is the police union's endorsement, and what does that say? They're going to be paying back to that police union. So somehow, I don't know how, but if they could depoliticize unions, that would be helpful. The other thing that would be helpful if unions could understand that they're still working for the people. Their job is to uh, provide their officers with support and due process, but it's like you're still working for your community. You're still officers in these communities, and there has to be some balance between what is right for the community and what is right for officers. And I think it's gone way overboard. So, um, so no abolishment. Let me just say this one thing about what I'm concerned about. I read about this even yesterday or today about someone was talking about different calls for policing are just social issues like domestic violence. And I thought, if you turn domestic violence into just a family problem again, this will have turned the domestic violence movement back 30 years or more. And it will again have officers thinking about it as a family problem and not something that needs intervention by the community to protect women. I'm very concerned about that in particular. There are other calls that I think would be fine to have advocates, social workers, especially the biggest issue is mental health issues when so much funding has gone away from that and those issues become police issues. So I
In
agree that.
fact, yeah. On that point, in Los Angeles, the nation's largest mental health facility happens to be the LA County Jail. And that tells us, quite a lot, on that point, right? So is your response to that is that, look, women could figure this out, keeping some of the structures in place, but you'd agree that there are police that are called to circumstances in which having experts would be better suited to arrive and address some of those situations.
Yes, because the thing is that as other social program funding has gone away, everything has become the police problem. And so, and especially again with mental health issues being number one. And police can't be everything. They
Well,
can't
and they
be.
certainly shouldn't be, right? I mean,
Yeah.
as these times show us. Before we wrap up, I do want us to talk a little bit more about police unions. And I want to come back to you, Dean Richardson, about your article and your work in this regard. It's very interesting because there's so much that gets conflated in thinking about police unions. Sometimes people think about, well, if you get rid of police unions, isn't that just like getting rid of unions that work on behalf of plumbers, electricians, and whatnot? And as I've said to that, no plumber gets to put his knee on your neck for nearly 9 minutes and get away with it and keep his job. There's no electrician who gets to meet you in your driveway and shoot you multiple times in your car while you're unarmed and your child is in the back seat, and yet keep his or her job and not arrested and prosecuted for it. So I think it's also very important to distinguish what is meant by these unions and what they do. Could you just fill us in a little bit on that?
Absolutely, and you're so right with the points that you make. And once again, so if we were to think about eliminating police unions altogether, I just want to make the point just one more time that that wouldn't solve the problems, right? Because some statutes exist because politicians passed them, these law enforcement officer Bill of Rights that contain the identical provisions that are in union contracts that are so problematic. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what is problematic in some of these union contracts and makes it so difficult to discipline officers who engage in serious misconduct and murder. One of the most important pieces of it is officers in these union contracts or in these statutes I just talked about can take any discipline meted out by a chief, right? Because chiefs don't want bad officers in the department either. And so a chief will sanction or discipline an officer. The officer often gets to have a say in who the arbitrator is because there's often mandatory arbitration. So the officer is disciplined by the chief. It goes into an arbitration, and arbitrators, more often than not, will reverse the discipline and force the rehiring of officers, right? And so in San Antonio, for instance, 70%, I believe that's the number, of officers who were disciplined and fired had to be rehired, right? Based on the arbitrator's decision. That is ridiculous, right? So often we point to the union, but we should be pointing our fingers at arbitrators too, at politicians who pass these laws and approve these contracts. And so there are very problematic provisions within union contracts that I believe should be eliminated, both from the contracts and from the bills. Another one is, I'll just mention a couple more and then stop, preventing investigations of anonymous civilian complaints, right? That's a scary provision because so many of us will file complaints anonymously because of our fear of retaliation. Another thing that happened, right? And another thing that unions, the power that they have within departments, I think this is an important point related to our earlier discussion. There are officers, rank and file officers, like some that we have on this call today, who dislike what is happening in their department, who want the bad officers to be punished. And yet they too are silenced because they see what happens to bad officers. They see the support given to officers who engage in violent misconduct. They see these officers returning to the police department because their discipline was overturned. And that is something that prevents culture from changing because you learn as a rank and file officer, I better not say anything because this officer is likely to come back and then I will face the wrath of my fellow officers. So there is much to talk about when it comes to unions.
That's right. I can't agree more with what you just said. And I wanted to add something to that the whole issue of how the sort of power that police unions begin to have in the sense of the entitlement they create and the privilege. So an example of this is that what happened in Buffalo. So two officers get suspended for pushing down a 75-year-old man, and 57 of their co-workers resigned from their unit. Now, that is entitlement to the max. They think they're so special that they can't, the department can't live without them. And that's how the union comes across too, is you can't live without us. You need us, and so we're going to get as much as we can get. And politicians run scared for that. They run scared that they're not going to get the union endorsement. And so there really does need to be political will to change. In the Buffalo case, those jobs are coveted key positions that they gave up. If I were their chief, I'd say, see you later. And then I'd say, by the way, you're still working the protest tonight, but just take off those ninja suits. And, you know, you got to have some courage to make change for sure.
I just want to quickly jump in and just really agree with Song that, that this issue of the union and arbitration laws are something that I really saw in my 2 years in Minneapolis. It was a source of unbelievable frustration to Chief Harteau that she would fire officers and then they would be back on the job, and the message that sent and the way that it undermined her authority. But we also followed a commander in internal affairs. And as she's trying to, work to rebuild trust in the community, she's watching these arbitration laws and the unions and really it sort of invalidates your work, because if you're in internal affairs and you're trying to investigate this and get the evidence that this officer needs to go, and then they're back on the job, it sort of becomes almost a charade in reform and accountability. And I just don't think that, I think that people really have to see that whole system as well, because I do think that there are people in policing who are working very hard and their work is being undermined by these systemic issues.
Well, and I think also this does discuss this idea of majority rules in unions. And so I've done some work looking at maternity policies and what police departments actually have maternity policies for women. And a lot of times it can't get past the union, right? Which then continues to keep, this idea of the numbers down, because where are you going to go if you have to use all your sick time to basically take care of your child when there should be some sort of leave associated with this? And so it continues to then have a male-dominated sort of status quo. But I do think that we, as a society, need to discuss what is our role in our communities to really engage this, right? And so I've worked with, civil service commissions, or I've worked with police departments who've had problems with changing their hiring process because their local civil service says, no, we don't want to change these roles, even if they see that there's a disproportionate impact on female applicants or individuals of color. And so it's challenging when the community or the society itself doesn't think about its role and how they perpetuate these problems in policing, in law enforcement.
I want to thank our guests because you've been absolutely exceptional today in providing us history, context, and also points of debate, helping us to understand the contemporary points of debate regarding policing in the United States today, and as well centering the issues and the concerns of women in this. We really could have this conversation multiple times for multiple hours because there's so much to unpack. We haven't even gotten to questions regarding qualified immunity and what does it take in order for there to be justice served. As we close out, I want to thank our listeners for joining us for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin. And I want to thank my guests, Dean Song Richardson, Professor Ann Lee Kringen, Laura Goodman, and also Deirdre Fishel for joining us and being part of this critical and insightful conversation. And to our listeners, I thank you for tuning in. We hope that you join us again for our next episode where we will be reporting, rebelling, and telling it like it is with special guests, Senator Carol Moseley Braun and Representative Katie Porter, and tackling issues addressing rebuilding America. It will be an episode like this one that you will not want to miss. Now, for more information on what we discussed today, please head to msmagazine.com. And if our listeners want to connect with you, my guest, through social media, where can they find you? We'll start with you, Song.
The easiest way to find me is to go to the UCI Law website, and then all of my accounts and email addresses are there.
All right, that sounds good. And hit her up on Twitter. And also, I believe that the law school has an Instagram account too. You'll find all of that at her UCI Law website. Just look for L. Song Richardson. And what about you, Ann Lee Kringen?
As well, all of my information is at the University of New Haven website. And I have only recently started, I believe, tweeting is the correct terminology.
Yes, I think that's what they call it. I'm a novice too.
And it's Ann Kringen on Twitter.
Laura, where might our listeners find you on social media?
Most of my information is on the website educationforcriticalthinking.org or my email at goodman@educationforcriticalthinking.org.
Thank you. And Deirdre, where can we tune in and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, well, you could go to my website, which is mindseyeprods.com, Mind's Eye Productions, or I am the head of the BFA in Film and Video at the City College of New York. So you can find me on the City College website.
Thank you so much. If you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America, being unbought and unbossed, and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to visit us at Apple Podcast. Look for us at msmagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. Rate and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher. Let us know what you think about our show. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Kathy Spiller and Michelle Goodwin are our executive producers. Our producers are Maddie Ponce and Roxy Zal. Our assistant producer is Rena Wakefield. And La Tiara, Rashid, and Zoe Larkin are our research assistants. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps and editing by Will Alvarez. Music is by Chris J. Lee. Stephanie Wilner provides executive assistance.